Imagine a world where money means nothing, where currencies collapse overnight, where governments slash the value of their own money just to survive, where global trade freezes. Banks fail, unemployment explodes, and economic desperation fuels political extremism. That was the world of the 1930s. The Great Depression wasn't just a stock market crash, it was a total breakdown of global financial order. Countries abandoned the classical gold standard one by one. Instead of cooperation, nations turned inward. They raised tariffs. They devalued their currencies. They engaged in what economists call beggar-the-neighbor policies, destroying each other's economies just to stay afloat. International trade collapsed by more than 60%. Entire populations were thrown into poverty. In that vacuum of chaos, extremist regimes rose. Economic instability didn't just contribute to global tension, it poured fuel on the fire that became World War II. By the early 1940s, Europe was physically shattered. Cities reduced to rubble, industrial capacity destroyed, governments bankrupt. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood in a completely different position. Its factories were booming, its infrastructure untouched, its gold reserves overflowing. By 1944, America held nearly two-thirds of the world's official gold reserves. The war was still raging. But the future needed to be built before the guns fell silent. So, in July 1944, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. It was remote, quiet, almost peaceful. But inside those walls, the battle for the future of global finance was about to unfold. Two men stood at the center of it all. On one side was John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, brilliant, charismatic, a visionary economist who had predicted the failures of the post-World War I settlement. Britain was exhausted from war, heavily indebted, and desperate for a system that wouldn't crush weakened economies. On the other side was Harry Dexter White, the American Treasury official, quiet, strategic, backed by the most powerful economy on earth. The United States was the creditor nation, the lender, the gold holder, and that meant leverage. Keynes proposed a new global currency called the Bancor, a neutral international unit of account that would prevent any one country from dominating the system. It was bold, it was innovative, and it would have limited American power. White proposed something different. He proposed a system centered on the US dollar. The negotiations were intense. Britain wanted flexibility, America wanted structure. But power speaks loudly in diplomacy, and America held the gold. The final agreement reshaped the world. Under the new system, every major currency would be pegged to the US dollar. Governments would maintain fixed exchange rates within a narrow band. And the US dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. This was the gold exchange standard. The dollar became the anchor. Gold sat behind the dollar, and the rest of the world linked their currencies to it. It created stability, predictability, confidence. Businesses could invest without fearing wild currency swings. Countries could rebuild knowing exchange rates wouldn't suddenly collapse. Trade expanded rapidly. Capital flowed across borders. From the late 1940s through the 1960s, the world experienced one of the fastest periods of economic growth in human history. But Bretton Woods wasn't just about exchange rates. Two new institutions were born: the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, designed to provide emergency loans and stabilize struggling economies, and the World Bank, created to finance reconstruction and long-term development. These institutions became the financial firefighters of the global system. If a country faced crisis, they stepped in to prevent contagion. For nearly 3 decades, the system worked. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The United States began running persistent trade deficits. Dollars flowed overseas to pay for military bases, foreign aid, and eventually, the Vietnam War. At the same time, domestic spending increased dramatically. More dollars circulated globally than the US had gold to back them. Foreign governments began to notice. If every dollar could theoretically be exchanged for gold, what would happen if too many countries demanded it at once? By the late 1960s, pressure intensified. France and other nations began converting dollars into gold. America's gold reserves started shrinking, The system depended on trust, and that trust was weakening. Then came August 10th, 1971. President Richard Nixon addressed the nation on television. In what became known as the Nixon shock, he announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporary. It never returned. The gold window was closed. The original Bretton Woods Agreement was effectively over. The world had entered the era of fiat currency, money backed not by gold, but by government decree and economic confidence. And yet, something remarkable happened. The dollar didn't collapse. Instead, it strengthened. Why? Because by 1971, the global financial system was already built around the dollar. International trade was invoiced in dollars, oil was priced in dollars, central banks held dollar reserves, financial markets were dollar-dominated. Even without gold, the dollar had network power. Trust shifted from gold to American economic strength, military dominance, and deep capital markets. The U.S. Treasury bond market became the new safe asset. The dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, not because it was backed by metal, but because it was embedded into every layer of global finance. And that legacy still shapes our world today. In the mid-2020s, international transactions, from energy deals to tech trade, still largely move through dollar-based systems. Global sanctions often rely on dollar clearing mechanisms. The infrastructure created at Bretton Woods, the IMF and World Bank, continues to influence economic policy worldwide. But new tensions are rising. Emerging powers, including nations within the BRICS bloc, have discussed alternatives to dollar dominance. Digital currencies, bilateral trade in local currencies, even proposals for new reserve mechanisms. Technology adds another layer. Central bank digital currencies, AI-driven financial systems. Blockchain networks, the nature of money itself is evolving. Yet the core architecture, a system born in a quiet New Hampshire hotel in 1944, still underpins global finance. The question now is profound. Is the world approaching another Bretton Woods moment? In 1944, leaders gathered to rebuild a shattered world and prevent economic chaos from igniting another global catastrophe. Today, the challenges are different: geopolitical rivalry, digital transformation, rising debt, and multipolar power. But the stakes feel familiar, because money is not just economics. It is power, stability, trust. Bretton Woods didn't just fix currencies to the US dollar. It shifted the center of gravity of the global economy. And whether the next transformation comes through crisis, innovation, or deliberate design, history suggests one thing with certainty: when the monetary order changes, the world changes with it. The only question is, who will write the rules next?